Okay. All right. Thanks so much, Lisa, and thanks to Nick for the invitation. I'm really excited to be presenting at the Scottish Aesthetics Forum, and I'm really excited to be presenting this paper particularly. This is a work in progress. I've been working on it for a year or two, and it probably has another year or so of work in it. So your feedback matters today, and I'm really grateful for it. So, anyways, it's great. Yeah, I'm very thankful. So, yeah, let's get into it. I could have talked about so many artworks, but I'm going to talk about this weird novel by Oakley Hall called Warlock. This weird novel from the 50s about Westerns in America. And just because I've started reading it recently, and it starts with this. This is in the prefatory note. Boy, Oakley Hall has inspired Thomas Pynchon and inspired a bunch of novelists. He says the fabric of the story. He's talking about how any similarity to people might not be coincidental. The fabric of this story is made up of actual events interwoven with invented events. By combining what did happen with what might have happened, I try to show what should have happened. And now this is what got me in. He says the pursuit of truth, not of facts, is the business of this novel, is the business of the novel. So he has this idea that fiction is supposed to try, or the novel is supposed to get at truth, which isn't facts. And that's the kind of connection that I want to talk about. Again, it comes from so many places, and I almost plucked this out at random. So let's think about this connection between beauty and truth. I just have to move my this screen here. Okay. We could start with this observation from Elaine Scarry in her book on beauty and being just. She notes that beauty seems to be bound up with truth. There seems to be an important connection between beauty and truth. And to take just two more examples at random from Tolstoy, because I found them and I thought they're interesting and they're both about Tolstoy. Isaac Babel said, if the world could write by itself, it would write like Tolstoy. So for Babel, there's this idea that Tolstoy is able to write something about the world the way, as it were, if the world itself could write, that's how it could write. And then there are very similar words about 60 years earlier from Charles Dubois on speaking about war and peace. He says, life would speak thus if life could speak. So there's this idea that just want to make sure people are seeing the presentation. There's this idea that, again, the novels are realistic. And look, what's important about these quotes from Tolstoy is that I take it that um, this is a virtue of these novels, that the very reason they're good, or at least one of the main reasons that they're good, is that because they can speak, as it were, from life itself, from the ultimate sort of realistic perspective. Now, we might wonder, what does this connection between truth and beauty come to? And Scary, for her part, says that the connection is a similarity. I just want to check the chat here and make sure that I'm not missing something I should be doing.
Everything's still to John.
Okay, cool. Great, 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 great. All right. So what's the still bit with truth and beauty? So Elaine Scarry says it's just a similarity. She says we have similar reactions to truth as we do to beauty. Truth convicts us, beauty convicts us, and so that's why they're importantly similar. But other people seem to think that there's a deeper connection between truth and beauty. And so I'm going to briefly talk about three people who see this deeper connection. The first is Iris Murdoch, and in her essay, The Idea of Perfection, she says repeatedly that the beautiful and the real amount to the same thing. To speak about the beautiful is just to speak about the real, according to Murdoch. She says this, any artist, she talks about it, the real is important for the good, but also she says, any artist would appreciate the notion of will as obedience to reality. So she's like, look, artists understand what I'm saying. They know that to properly create something is not to sort of navel gaze and look at how you want the world to be, but it's in fact to be responsive to the world and to be beholden to the world and to see the world as it is. Yeah. We could say also that just good artists pay attention to how things or people work and how they really are, and good artists can form their work accordingly. So again, they aren't like navel gazing. One more quote, apprehension of the good is apprehension of the individual and the real. So, there we get something like an identity between the good, part of which she includes beauty, and the real or the individual. I'll say more about the individual later. The second person who sees this connection, a closer connection than Scary sees, is John Ruskin. I don't know how people are feeling about John Ruskin these days. I've been reading Modern Painters and I've been loving it. For Ruskin, in the first volume of Modern Painters, he changes his view a little bit by the time he gets to the fifth volume. What is it, 40 years later? He says that paintings ought to be judged by their truth. So what makes a good painting is precisely that it's true. And for Ruskin, this has to do with, good paintings are paintings that get at this sort of deeper spiritual truth. He says this, most pictures of the Dutch school, for instance, and what are ostentatious and senseless words. And in the ellipses, what I've omitted is him saying, of course, I'm not talking about Rembrandt. I love Rembrandt. But he says most pictures of the Dutch school are ostentatious and senseless, while the early efforts of Cimabue and Giotto are the burning messages of prophecy delivered by the stammering lips of infants. So what Ruskin's is saying there, that even though they might not be so technically skilled, the paintings are not that much the worse for all that, because despite their technical deficiencies, these artists are still able to portray reality, to portray truth as it really is. Ruskin's truth here is something like Murdoch's reality. And he says, not only does he say that truth is a kind of beauty, he says that falsehood is a kind of ugliness. So he's willing to make the inverse claim too. Falsehood is in itself revolting and degrading. Truth is beautiful and falsehood is ugly. Now, Ruskin is clear, at least in the next volumes, he doesn't think that truth is identical with beauty because he thinks truth is a property of propositions and beauty is importantly non-propositional. But he does think that there's this very important relationship. So, yeah. Now, I want to trot out one more person here. I want to trot out, if we don't talk about Ruskin, I don't know, enough. Maybe, I don't know. We also don't talk about Thoreau, and maybe not enough. So, this is not just a view about art. If you read Henry David Thoreau's Walden, Thoreau argues that nature is beautiful precisely because of its identity with reality or its similarity with reality. I mean, Walden is about searching for sort of like the beautiful or the true, and Walden and Thoreau takes these to be identical. Our hunger for the beautiful is realized in nature precisely because we get at reality more in nature more than we could get at reality through anything else. And this is how he ends the second chapter. He says this passage, famous passage. If you stand right fronting and face to a fact, you will see the sun glimmer on both its surfaces. He's talking about if we could really just once see things as they are. You will feel its sweet edge dividing you through the heart and the marrow. So it's something like if you could actually see this fact, it would cut you in half. And so you will happily conclude your mortal career. You would be happy to die if you could just once see a fact as it really exists. And then he has this great line. He says, be it life or death, we crave only reality. So we don't crave pleasure. We crave reality. These are the kind of views that I'm interested in pursuing. All of these folks hold that beauty is at least sometimes inextricable from truth or reality. Even if it's not identical, it's at least sometimes beauty is inextricable. There's something necessarily beautiful about reality. And I think all these comments suggest a kind of view about beauty. I don't think they imply this view. I don't think they prove this view. I don't think they're setting out to prove this view. But to me, all these things, people like this strongly suggest a view like this, the veracity of beauty. Here's one first pass at what I mean by the veracity of beauty. It says that some things are beautiful inasmuch as they are the most importantly true, or they're the most importantly real, Or you might say something like some things are beautiful in as much as they reflect reality at its deeper joints, or maybe at its deepest joints. Some things are beautiful in as much as they reflect truth at its deeper joints or at its deepest joints. Something like that. Let me turn around one more time on the thesis. And here's, I think, the kind of formulation that I want to go with. It says that the beauty of some things consists in their reality. So the fact that they just are real at some fundamental level, or in their inheritance of reality, their revelation of reality, their display of reality, their portrayal of reality. So some things are beautiful just because they're real. And okay, I already said this. When I talk about some things inheriting reality, I mean that they disclose it or display it or reveal it. And so we could say this about that view. The idea is like reality as such is finally aesthetically valuable. Let me say it again. Reality as such is finally aesthetically valuable. And our works, our nature, are valuable to at least to the extent that they display this value, or they're identical to this value, or they reveal this value. So, I mean, there's this like, if you think about like truth, beauty, and goodness, you might think that this kind of view starts to get us. I'm not saying anything about goodness. I don't know about goodness, but it starts to get reality and beauty to truth and beauty to be pretty close together. And the idea is truth at its core, at its deepest level. There are layers of truth or deeper and more shallower truth. And at its core, truth is just what's finally beautiful. And then things are beautiful when they reveal this value. All right, I think that should be clear. When I'm talking about this view today, I want to, I don't know. I'm trying to be relevant, I guess. So I'm discussing this view as the same register as contemporary theories of aesthetic value, which seem to be all the rage these days in aesthetics. And one question for a contemporary theory of aesthetic value is this question: what makes aesthetic value valuable? You could ask what makes it aesthetic. I'm not answering that question. You can see why I really don't want to answer that question, maybe. But I do want to think about that this view gives us an answer to the value question. This is what James Shelley calls the value question. Now, there are many theories about what makes aesthetic value or beauty. I'm using aesthetic value and beauty in the same to be coincidental. Um, Here are some popular theories. Some popular theories say that aesthetic value is instrumentally valuable. It's valuable because it promotes other goods, final goods that lie outside of beauty. So maybe aesthetic value is great because it promotes community, and community is finally good, and beauty promotes that. Maybe they promote the final good of pleasure. Maybe they promote this final good of engagement, or maybe engagement leads us to pleasure. I don't know, but that's been a suggestion lately. Or maybe aesthetic value is instrumentally valuable because it promotes knowledge. So I'm thinking about all these views and I'm trying to distinguish this veracity of beauty view. And part of when I say what I want to think about veracity of beauty is that it denies that beauty is instrumentally valuable. I want to hold that beauty can be intrinsically valuable. But we can say, even if beauty is finally good, we can say something about what beauty consists in, at least some of the time. We can say something about what beauty amounts to. And what we can say is that, at least sometimes, the beauty of something lies in its very reality or in its disclosure of reality. I know I've said that a million times. I just want to make sure it's clear. I'm setting myself up to get to the roadmap here, but before I do that, I just want to mention a couple of limits on the kind of argument I'm making. Um, the first thing is that I'm not arguing that this is true of any particular artwork, although I think it's pretty persuasive that it's true of some particular artworks. I'm not arguing that the veracity of beauty is any true of any like genre or art form or importantly style. So I'll have lots to say about realism, but this isn't about realistic styles as such. I'll repeat that. So for right now, I want to leave it open how broadly this thesis extends out. Maybe everything that's beautiful is beautiful because it is real or because it reflects reality. Maybe some things are beautiful because they are real or they reflect real. Maybe one thing, but the core of the thesis is just that the beauty of some things consists in their reality. So I think I probably have a little bit more modesty in the way that I'm putting this version of the thesis than, for example, Ruskin or Murdoch or Thoreau would if this is the kind of thesis that I think they'd want to make it think it's true of all aesthetic value. I'm happy to just think it's true. It's where what some beauty consists in. So I'm not trying to make this general claim about all beauty, but I think it's enough to show that some things work like this. This kind of view raises a bunch of questions. How is this thesis related to realism, in particular realistic styles? I just gestured at that. Does it mean that realistic artworks are better? What does it even mean when we talk about reality or truth? Um, Maybe the most frustrating thing about this paper is the fact that I have to use words like truth or realism, which seem naive or blunt or foolish in this kind of context. When you're talking to philosophers, like, well, I don't, you can see why you might not want to use, I don't know if we could say triggering words like that. And I think the most important question about if we could call it the bones of this project, which is like, what would be valuable about reality as such? I think that's ultimately what such a view needs to answer, like this question. So here's the roadmap for the paper. We're finally getting to the roadmap. First of all, I'm going to talk about some precedent for the veracity of beauty. Then I'm going to explain that I think veracity of beauty explains some art critical realisms, what our critics have said about the importance of reality. Then I'm going to try to get clear on what exactly it's saying, and I'm going to canvass some arguments why you might think this is true. If there's time, I'll talk about objections, but uh, if I don't get to objections, I'm sure we've got some. So, and if there are no questions, I could just talk about objections. All right, so let's talk about some precedent for the view. I play with calling this kind of view diotomus, or this part of the paper diotomus legacy, because this is really a legacy of diotoma. You can think of maybe you already are thinking of diotoma in the Symposium, Plato's Symposium. And if you'll remember, Socrates recounts what he learned from diotoma. He learned that love is probably directed towards the lovable. Well, I guess he already knew that. But and things are lovable for their natures rather than for their appearances. So the kinds of things we should love are lovable not for how they look, but for how they are. And when we talk about things, loving things for how they are, I hope you can start to see how reality might play some kind of role. Now you add to this very sort of Platonist view that the nature of things, let's say deeper or more real things, you could cash this out in a bunch of ways, but the nature of everything is such as to be grasped by the intellect and not sensation, and things are more real rather than less real when they are such as to be wholly grasped by the intellect and not sensation. So here's Diotima's ladder, here's how we learn to, we begin by loving this one body, and then we love multiple bodies. And then I hope I have this order right. I forgot to check. I think then we learn to love souls, and then we learn to love customs and rituals, and then we get to the form of the good. And you'll notice we're beginning with the sensual and we're getting to the spiritual. The form of the good has no physical or perceptible aspect to itself. So we're and notice too that the form of the good is a more sort of, well, yeah, is a more real thing. And to talk about that, let's just go to the Phaedrus, where I think the view is even more clear. In the Phaedrus, the search for love or beauty is really a desire to see things as they really are. That's how Socrates casts the search for beauty in the Phaedrus. And he says that he begins by talking about how the gods, gods work and then what it means to be godlike. So the God's mind is nourished by intelligence and pure knowledge, and so it's delighted to be seeing what is real and watching what is true. So this desire we have for beauty is really ultimately realized when we can see what is real. It's the knowledge of what really is what it is. That is as a spiritual and not a I mean formal, we could say, I guess, and not a perceptible thing. And this passage stands out. The reason there's so much eagerness to see the plane where truth, so why do we want to understand truth so much? The reason there's so much eagerness to see the plane where truth stands is that this pasture has the grass that is the right food for the best part of the soul. And it's the nature of these wings through which we fly up. It's the nature of these wings that lift up the soul to be nourished by it. So now it's something like, oh, the reason we want to see truth so much is because it's a kind of food for our souls. Now, th- I just want to, it seems, excuse me, it seems to me that beauty here consists in reality. Things are great not because we can know them or understand them, but the reason it's good to know them is because reality is great. You might meditate on that passage and not exactly see that point, or come to a different idea, but I hope you can see this idea that like these are things worth knowing, and they're worth knowing because they're real, because they're like what really is what it is. And then we could talk about Plotinus, who, who, if Plato has a kind of formalism, Plotinus makes it a kind of spiritualism. And again, Plotinus thinks that we arise up through the sensual towards the spiritual. So here's this part from the Enneads, which gets at what I'm talking about. Plotinus writes, we love and delight in these qualities, but why do we call them beautiful? What makes them beautiful? These qualities exist and they appear to us, and he who sees them cannot possibly say anything else except that they are what really exists. So Plotinus almost has a sort of quietism about what makes things beautiful. At least that's how it seems in this translation. Um, this passage makes it sound as though what makes things beautiful is just that these things are what really exists. And it's sort of all there is to beauty is just this kind of like ultimate reality. This is just I'm just bringing out all the most neglected people in aesthetics, uh, justly or not. So yeah, actually, Aquinas has a different kind of view. Aquinas holds that beauty is what he calls a transcendental, which means that beauty is simply an aspect or dimension of existence itself. To say that something is beautiful is no more, according to Aquinas, no more than to say that it exists. I mean, you can see why Aquinas would think this. To call something beautiful is just to say, so, sorry, in other words, to call something beautiful is just to say that it exists under one specific description. So, beauty is just sort of one aspect or dimension of existence, but beauty just refers to existence. You can see why Aquinas would think something like that, right? He thinks that God is intrinsically beautiful, and therefore, if you think that God's intrinsically beautiful, it's not so far-fetched to think that whatever exists at the hand of God's creative act is also going to be necessarily beautiful. I mean, and if you think existence itself comes at the hand of God's creative act, then everything is just what it means to exist is just to be beautiful. I'll talk about some more precedent. We can look at 18th century German rationalists. I haven't presented this version of the paper, and I'm noticing that I'm not exactly appealing to the most palatable people in general. So I guess I'm going crazy. Anyways, people like Lessing and Leibniz and Mendelssohn hold that beauty is ultimately the perception of perfection. So they also like this, the trinity of the true, the good, and the beautiful. And look, if you think beauty is just simply perfection, or the perception of beauty is the perception of perfection, there's a reason that, for example, Fred Beiser calls these guys dichotomous children, because if you think that perfection is just an ultimate normative truth, then perfection is just sort of the the ground zero of reality or something like that. Even if it's not realized in, physical reality or perceptible reality or whatever you like. So beauty is, not part of some deeper reality or nothing but this deeper reality of perfection or something like that. Okay. I just want to remind you that some of the greats talk about this view. And I'm gonna stop at the German rationalists, and you might be really skeptical of this right now. But we already talked about modern philosophers like Thoreau and Murdoch and Ruskin. So no, no, no. It's because I'm going to go on now to talk about contemporary art criticism that I think all requires a view like this. At least some important instances of contemporary art criticism require a view like the veracity of beauty. All right. So this is why I'm calling it the ambition of realisms. Well, let me just say for now that I think the veracity of beauty explains what I'm going to try to show is that the veracity of beauty explains or is entailed by certain things that art critics over the past 100 years have said about realism. And this is a painting by Chardin. So let's turn to art criticism. I'm not going to talk about any particular realistic style in art. There are many kinds of realism. There are many, we might say, many realisms. And by that, I mean many realistic styles. What I'm concerned with instead is praise for artworks, the basis of which is their realism. So whether or not they're in a realistic style, I think there's some praise for artworks that depends upon reality being the sort of final aesthetic good. I'm going to really talk about two, I'd say popular styles. I don't know how popular they are, um, but I think they confirm something like the veracity of beauty, or depend on it, or require it, or something like that. So, first man with the cigarette. This is Andre Bazin. He famously he praised films for all kinds of reasons, but one of the reasons he praised films was for their realistic content and their realistic form. So he's praising directors like Orson Welles and Renoir and De Sica, Vittorio De Sica, whose film I want to talk about. The Bicycle Thieves, I think it's 1948. I want to talk about a terrific essay that Bazin writes about bicycle thieves. He talks about his main argument really is that this is like an incredible form of realism. And I mean, look, he loves the realism. Is it real? Is it in a realistic style? Again, I don't want to say anything about a style of realism. It's certainly often called neorealism. So take that for what you will. But Bazin praises this film for its realism. It has a realistic kind of narrative logic. The way events unfold, the way the situation unfolds seems contingent as it's unfolding, but he says in retrospect, it looks like as though it was all inevitable. And he says that's how life feels. He thinks it's also realistic because of the untrained actors. De Sica did not hire trained actor or professional actors, and Bazin is saying that lends a kind of authenticity or sincerity to them. But this is really what he's building up to, an incredible ending to this essay. Here's what Bazin says. He says the true merit of this movie lies in not betraying the essence of things. Its true merit lies in allowing things, first of all, to exist for their own sakes, freely, in loving them in their singular individuality. So the true merit of this film lies in the fact that it gets things for what they are. And it seems like he's saying this comes from a certain place of love, I think. There's a lot of ways you could understand this passage, but I think that's something. And then I love these couple sentences. He says, "My little sister reality," says Jessica, And she, that is that is reality, she circles about him like the birds around St. Francis. Other directors put her in a cage or teach her to talk. But Dasika talks with her, and it is the true language of reality that we hear, the word that cannot be denied, that only love can utter. So the idea, I take it, is something like Desika never. One thing that makes these films so realistic is that the realism never feels forced. It always feels like Desika's never trying to get these things to say what they are. He wants to hear what they are. Um, Notice, I love that, he doesn't put her in a cage, he doesn't teach her to talk, but we hear this language of reality. So I don't know, there's such a rich path, to teach something to talk means that it's going to talk to you in your language, but to hear the true language of reality, maybe there's some other kind of language. And again, we see this important connection of love in sort of bringing forth reality. I'm going to call this kind of view individual realism. This is one kind of realism that Bazin has in mind when he's enthusiastic about this movie. Let me put it this way. The aesthetic value of some artworks consists in their portrayal of people or things as they really are. The reason some artworks are beautiful is consists in the fact that they portray people and things as they really are. That is, as first of all, valuable, both valuable for their own sakes and valuable in what I would say is the fullness of their particularity. Again, it harkens back to this idea that he's not trying to make them talk his language. He wants to understand the particular things that they are. And it's valuable, and their value is revealed through a stance of love. I won't have a whole lot to say about love, but it's going to be interesting. I mean, your love keeps coming up when people use this language about reality. But I hope that's clear, this is just a version of the veracity of beauty. This is just sort of what we might call one instance of the veracity of beauty, right? It says something about what this reality amounts to. It And notice, well, yeah. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Um, Says something about what reality amounts to. And notice, no, notice, look, for Bazin, the films are beautiful. Their beauty comes from respecting the things as they are. Like it's all, as it were, inherited from reality. That's the point I want to keep getting at. We see such a similar view in throughout James Baldwin. In fact, here's another picture of a man smoking a cigarette. I don't know why. Uh, in his essay, Everybody's Protest novel, Baldwin is talking about the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. He's also talking about the novel Native Son by Richard Wright. And he's saying that both of these novels have the problem that he calls the problem of the social protest novel. The problem with the social protest novel, according to Baldwin, is that these novels are not concerned with truth. He says that truth, as it's used here, is meant to apply devotion to the human being, his freedom and fulfillment, freedom which can't be legislated, fulfillment which can't be charted. Maybe I'll skip. I notice I'm getting a little, I don't want to get short on time. So, he says these novels don't work because they're not treating human beings as truly particular individuals. And, he says only, human beings have this ambiguity and paradox and hunger and danger and darkness. And to treat humans as though they're just, members of one kind of thing, as though their sort of future is foreclosed upon them, is to not get at the truth about what makes humans what humans are. And Baldwin says it's this power of revelation, which is the business of the novelist, this journey toward a more vast reality, which must take precedence over all other claims. I mean, there's an important difference between Baldwin and Bazin, which we could talk about, but I think it's clear that Baldwin is coming very close to something like the veracity of beauty. What makes these novels good is that they can portray things as they are. And and the beauty of the novel is at least partly inherited from the beauty that humans have. Now, to sort of get the oomph or the push of the veracity of beauty, I just want to compare it with a view like intentionalism, which I think is a kind of knee-jerk view that we have when we're evaluating a work of art. Uh, think of, I think the main the arch intentionalist is Noel Carroll. For Carroll, the ultimate way to judge an artwork is through its creator's aims. So you just see like what did the artist mean to do, and did they mean to do a good thing? Are the aims good, and then did they pull them off? And how can you explain the value of realism for the intentionalist? Well, you could say something like realistic artworks are good when they're realistic because they pull off this aim of the creator's ambition that the creator sort of happened to have towards realism. In other words, realism is only good in for the intentionalist when and because it's a successful execution of a noteworthy aim. And notice for the intentionalist, realist aims are just some among many possible aims that realize some other good. So if your benchmark for what makes an artwork great is that it realizes some aim, then it doesn't speak to the value of the aim. The aim could be realism, it could be pure fantasy, it could be anything you like. There's nothing essentially good about realism. Realism, we could say, is a hypothetical good. It's only good because, we're just admiring how this artwork realizes pulling off whatever they intended, and they intended to be realistic. So here's the problem. Views like the intentionalist view can't explain Bazin's or Baldwin's criticism. They can't take realism to be a foundational or categorical view. Bazin and Baldwin take it that realism is a categorical good. Realism inherits the good because inherits the good of the real that it's about. The beauty in these works, we could say, is inherited from reality. There's one other thing I could say. Let me try to get this in. I think I think maybe a separate problem. And I don't just mean to attack. I'm not attacking Noel Carroll, but I think these are like prominent views. Compare modern moralism, where you say something like, well, something like mere realism. Think about what Bazin said and Baldwin said about, oh, we need to respect people. You might say, oh, that sounds moral. And then you could say, if you're a modern moralist, you go, well, yeah, you shouldn't, you should respect people and you should portray them as individual. But that's just because if you don't, then people are going to be distracted by the immorality in the work. And then the work's not going to pull off whatever it intends to pull off. And notice that if you take this tack, then the moral constraint here is sort of external to the success of the work. It just gives you sort of bumpers that you have to stay within as though you're bowling. But according to the veracity of beauty, realism lies at the core of why these works are successful in the way that they're successful. Veracity of beauty can explain why we care so centrally about getting these moral facts right. We care about getting these moral facts right because they reveal something about reality, and reality is finally aesthetically good, even if reality might be good in other ways too. All right, so here's a second example of a kind of realism that I want to talk about. The art critic Michael Fried makes this distinction between theatrical works and absorptive works. He's talking specifically about paintings or photographs. He says that theatrical paintings are paintings in which the figures court the viewer. Sorry, so let me just make sure I'm saying, we just talked about what did I call it? Singular realism or individual realism. And now I'm going to introduce this other kind by talking about this distinction. There's a second kind of realism. In theatrical paintings, figures court the viewer. The viewer is ontologically implicated. So here's an example of a theatrical painting. This is Fragonard's The Swing. Fried thinks that this is a theatrical painting because she has, as it were, her arms outstretched. She's performing for the audience, and we couldn't imagine this scene unless we imagine it as a painting with an audience. That's what Fried says. You might deny that. Fried contrasts theatrical paintings, which, as it were, exist for the viewer. We're ontologically implicated in the world of the artwork. Contrast theatrical paintings with absorptive paintings, where these figures in these paintings don't court the viewer. The viewer's not in the world of the painting. The painting doesn't require any viewer for its world to be, as it were, fully realized. And this allows the paintings to function more realistically, to more fully imagine a realistic world. So the example for this is another Chardin work. I think it's called The Draftsman, although There are a couple of Chardin paintings named the Draftsman, and this isn't the most famous one. But what's important about this is that the figure has his back to the audience. So in no way do we need to imagine ourselves in order to imagine the world of this painting. And so I just want to think, when you think about this kind of criticism, you just think, well, why should we care if the paintings successfully depict a more lifelike scenario? Why is that valuable? Why should we care if they more fully realize a world that is faithful to the kind of one that we inhabit? I think that strongly suggests like something like the veracity of beauty is true. They're realistic and then they're inheriting their value from reality. But let me give you something a little bit more specific. This is Caravaggio, Death of the Maiden, I think, or Death of the Virgin. Caravaggio. Now, realism is of various styles is an obsession with Michael Fried over decades and decades. And I want to quote something he says from another art critic, Friedman. I forget Friedman's first. I don't know Friedman's first name, but here's what Caravaggio says about this painting. There's a typo. The center of gravity in Caravaggio's style, the center of gravity is anchored at a far different depth into reality than classicism. He's comparing Caravaggio with previous classicist works. And while and while he endows the ordinary with the dignity of both form and emotion, he never tries to escape reality or contravene it. He's willing to take reality head on. And as this art probes more deeply into physical reality, so does it come to seek with ever increasing profundity the inner reality of psychological experience. In the death of the Virgin, the tenor of emotion, contained and stilled, remains like that of classicism, but it probes in private regions that the conventions of classicism, what the conventions of classicism would clear off. There's no secret of the psyche that Caravaggio cannot find out. So if the last point was about like getting at sort of persons for who they are, this is about getting sort of at affect for what it is, or the psyche for what it is, or the psychology for what it is. And so as Caravaggio searches out, this is Friedman continues, as Caravaggio searches out the depths of feeling, he insists increasingly that it convey a total authenticity, requires that emotion wear the look and carry the behavior of the ordinary world as different as possible from the styled world of art. In the Death of the Virgin, the only touch of rhetoric or self-conscious art is an accessory of setting in the curtain. The human actors, unrhetorical and styleless, convey in each countenance their absolute veracity of feeling. And he says this is magnified by the complete absence in the actors of any device or action or dramatic kind. And I want to ask the question of like, why do these kind of art critical praise, why does it always end? It just ends here with this idea that it's so lifelike. And being lifelike, I think one way to make sense of it is just to say that real things are beautiful because they're real. And to be lifelike means that you inherit this kind of value that reality has. So we could say this, I'm calling this effective realism. It's another kind of realism. It says that the aesthetic value of some works of art consists in their portrayal of people or things as they really are, again, just as they really are. That is the portrayal of inner affective life in its deeper and more authentic forms. So implicit in this discussion is that affective life, someone's psyche can be deeper or more shallow. And works are great when they portray psychology in its deeper forms without artistic or dramatic flourish. It's just another example. So in these views, like it's not real that realism is just these like technical flaws that you have to steer clear of. And if you steer clear of them, you're good. It's not the sort of prevention of this aesthetic flaw. What I think realism is amounting to here is a positive good in these works. It might not be the only aesthetic positive good, but I take it that these works are good because they're portraying something good. They're inheriting their value from the things which they're depicting, from the fact that what they're depicting is real. I also want to comment that I think the value here is not just epistemic, right? It's not just that we can learn a lesson, because I take it that someone who had already learned these lessons about effective life could still be confronted with something about how remarkable it is to portray the real so faithfully. So the value isn't coming from our understanding things as they are. The value is coming from the fact that things at their deepest level have this final aesthetic value, and that's what we're accessing. So the epistemic goods are only there because there's value in the real. Now, those are just two examples of the kind of realisms that I'm talking about. Like there's all kinds of things that people say to justify why reality sorry, there's all kinds of ways that people spell out something like the veracity of beauty. All kinds of versions, not just the two that I'm giving you. So Murdoch talks about disinterest. Ruskin talks about this idea that truth is valuable when it's more particular, not abstract. That does connect with stuff we've talked about. Plotinus talks about the spiritual aspect. Now, my goal isn't to sort out these accounts of reality. One way to put it is that I do not want to give a substantive account of reality, and I don't think I need to. Have I? Yeah, I'll come back to that later. Um, I just want to point at this class of views that seem to have been ignored, that seem to think that things are beautiful because they're inheriting value from reality, and what that reality amounts to, that's for another day, but I want to focus on these kinds of views. In these views, there are deeper and shallower levels of reality, and reality in its deeper forms is finally aesthetically valuable. I think I've said that enough time. And we could just, here's another slogan: good artworks and nature sound the depths of reality, and that's precisely what makes them good. None of these views are associated with any particular artistic style of realism. And in fact, the veracity of beauty may arise in non-realistic artworks. So take fantasy, take social commentary of fantasy. I take it that the point of many, perhaps not all, the point of many fantasy works is to think back to the comments by Oakley Hall about Warlock. The point of many fantasy works is to teach us something about how things are by showing us how they could have been. And so rather than attach ourselves to this contingent reality, we start to see things more at their hinges or at their joints. You can think about like Aristotle, on poetry rather than history. Even Bresson, the director, who's I would say not at all a realist, in his diary he talks about the desire to rid myself of accumulated errors and untruths, and he wants to get at being instead of seeming. So in no way am I trying to say that this is only true or even always true of realistic styles. I think it's true of all kinds of styles of art, but there are ways that reality, it seems to me, can be true. So another point. Look, for Bazin, realism requires defamiliarization and artifice, and it's not as though to get at things as they really are, you just take your camera and you're pointed at any old corner of reality and you just press play and then you're going to get reality. No, that's going to take work, and it should be clear why it's going to take work, especially if you're like Plato and you don't think that what's perceptible is necessarily going to take us to the real forms of things. So the thing is that what's important for Bazin is just that the visage of the real imparts aesthetic value. That's the kind of view that I'm after. All right. Why believe the veracity of beauty? I think I have about 15 minutes? Something like this. Or 10, or okay, all right.
That's fine, John. Yeah.
Okay, great. So why should we believe it? Murdoch gives this example about the importance of the real. And she talks about this case of the mother-in-law, and the mother-in-law can't see their daughter-in-law properly, can't see her daughter-in-law for who she really is. She's acting meanly well, she's actually not acting meanly, but she has bad thoughts about her daughter-in-law. And Murdoch's thought is that to act well, the mother-in-law has to see the daughter-in-law for who she really is. Um, that's just, yeah. And And look, I think, you can see, yeah, okay, it's clear that there's some kind of important connection between morality and truth. If you don't see things as they are, if you don't see people as they are, you're not going to act well, you're not going to act virtuously. And it's clear why there's this connection between morality and veracity. But but I think it's not so clear in aesthetics why there should be such a connection. Why are artworks aesthetically better for portraying things as they are rather than just dreaming up in imagination? And notice, I want to be like, I'm not saying this is the only source of beauty. There could be other sources of beauty. I just think this is the source of some beauty in some artworks. But but it raises this question, why think that ever happens? Murdoch's answer to this view, Murdoch's own answer is that, well, when we see reality as it is, we engage in this process of what she calls unselfing. We have this tendency to navel gaze, she thinks. She's very pessimistic about humans. And yeah, from my own experience, I can relate. I feel like I struggle with this. She says the chief enemy of excellence in morality and in art is personal fantasy. It's the issue of self-aggrandizing and consoling wishes and dreams which prevents one from seeing what there is outside of one. So we have this tendency to navel gaze and it leads us astray. And like I said, that's clear in morality. And why should we think it's true in art? Well, you might say realistic art takes our focus off of ourselves and it removes our selfish tendencies. When artists focus on things as they are and not on themselves, we're able to see the world more fully, more clearly. But I think it shows, first of all, that realism would be necessary for moral art or moralizing art, but it's not clear why there's any aesthetic good there. And secondly, even if you thought there was an aesthetic good there, it seems to me this shows that realism is necessary, but it's not sufficient for beauty. So it's still not enough to bolster some of the claims that Murdoch is saying, that there's this sort of, deep connection between truth and reality. Just because we're not navel gazing, just because we're looking at things, trying to look at things for there, doesn't mean there aren't other sort of sins that we have that are leading us astray. That's, selfishness is not, we could say, the only sin that we have. And you shouldn't think it's the only flaw. I'll put this another way. I think that Murdoch can only explain the value of realism in what we could call a fallen world, a world of selfish persons. And if we weren't selfish anymore, there would be no cause for realism. But I think there would still be. Here's another answer that Murdoch suggests. Okay, what's so great about reality? Something else she says many things in this essay. She says that reality is difficult and indefinable. And then she said, and you might think, look, realistic art inherits this difficulty, and the difficulty is good. The problem here is maybe there's more in the essay, maybe I haven't seen it, but it's not clear why indefinability or difficulty would be so great. Is it great because we're like hard at work cognitively? But furthermore, I think there's a more serious problem, which is that if you think reality is so great because it's difficult, and then that makes artworks that inherit reality would be difficult too. This, look, I'm not trying to be a Kantian. This is definitely not a Kantian kind of view, but I think that one important insight that Kant brings to the fore is the idea that beauty makes us feel at home in the world. And if this, and this route, I think, makes me nervous because I think if you take this route, that reality is difficult and indefinable, you don't get to say that beauty uh, has us feeling at home in the world. Here's another way to cash out difficulty. There's another kind of reason that you might say, well, the beauty of some artworks consists in their reality, and reality is difficult. And here's why it's good that beauty should consist in reality. It comes from Simone Weil, who, in large part, these reflections from Simone Weil are largely the inspiration for Murdoch's essay, the perfection of the, I can't remember. Anyways, Simone Weil says, here's Simone Weil on the trouble with loving heaven. She says, in a sense, heaven's too difficult to love because we don't know it. Above all, it's too easy to love because we can imagine it as we please. So, the problem with loving heaven is that we don't even know. We don't even know what we're loving, and we can imagine however we like. We can see how Murdoch's getting these thoughts from Weil about making up what we want. And Vey says, no, it's important that we love the country of here below. And I hope you can see, she says, it is real. It offers resistance to love. It is this country that God has given us to love. He has willed that it should be difficult yet possible to love it. So here we get this sense of difficulty, but it's something like this world is what we have, and it's the world that God has given us to love. And art is good because it takes part in that. Something like this. Realistic art is good. Now, um, I think there are two things that Vey might be saying here. It might be a divine command theory. Sorry, there's an error that shouldn't say. It should be, it looks like a divine command theory of the beautiful. It looks like we should find this beautiful because God said it's beautiful. And I don't know. I think maybe we should keep looking around for a basis before we go to the divine command theory of aesthetics, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. There's a second kind of thought that I think they might have, which is what I'm going to call a finish your dinner approach to the good. It's like, well, look, what use is there complaining about what's on your plate? This is just what you have. This is what your parents made you, and you better finish it and enjoy it. I think this is also very unsatisfying. It implies that if all we were stuck with was like Thomas Kinkade paintings, then we should learn to love Thomas Kinkade paintings or take whatever artwork you don't like. I just think like, especially if we're thinking about diatima, this cannot be the right way to go. Like beauty is trying to get us to something higher, not get us to sort of settle. And I think Vey's saying that we need to settle. Where I'm going to go instead is with this existentialist philosopher, Gabriel Marcel. There's so many religious people in this talk. Gabriel Marcel, the French Catholic existentialism, who makes this nice distinction between hope and optimism. And I'm going to draw on this distinction to get a sort of answer about why I think reality that helps us explain this connection between reality and beauty. For Marcel, I think this is in his book Homo Viator, A Metaphysics of Hope. Both optimism and hope began with a trial. So you experiencing these things with the trial. And he's saying that hope is not the same thing as optimism. The optimist is impersonal. The optimist takes this sort of third person point of view. They don't sit with it in the trial. The optimist is an egoist. They consider themselves an authority on the problem. They say, well, if actually what you don't realize is this other thing. And so you got to try to see it from outside. The optimist point of view is external. The optimist extracts themselves from the scenario that follows from the impersonality. And importantly, the optimist is what I'm going to call oratorial. Uh, Marcel says that the optimists lends themselves to oratorical speeches and written expressions. This means that they have a kind of presence of mind despite this trial, that they're able to sort of analyze it. They have this analytical mind. But he thinks for Marcel, hope is much different. Hope doesn't involve this kind of analytical state of mind. For Marcel, the hopeful person is always personal. The trial is always personal. They're enmeshed in this trial. They see it essentially from a first person point of view. And instead of bragging in their own ability to see things, well, what you don't realize is that the economy is going to turn around, or instead of that attitude of the optimist, the hopeful person is humble. There's a kind of timidity, Marcel says, or chastity. The hopeful person is communal. Their hope involves a shared object with others. The hopeful person has, importantly, a kind of a confusion. The person with hope, he says, doesn't have the presence of mind to write about it. The trial is for the person of hope a mystery and not a problem. And the idea is, well, for the optimist, this is just a problem to be solved. A problem, you just need to see more numbers or more data or have a bigger knowledge of history or economics, and you'll see this is not so bad. Whereas the person with hope is in a way unable to say anything about their hope. They're unable to analyze it, and you can say this is because they're enmeshed in the trial or because they're in the first person. And here's my wild suggestion here. Suppose that the trial is this world. This world is our trial. And I don't mean, I'm not trying to invoke any religious commitments that you might or might not have. I don't think it takes much to think of the world as full of trials. If our situation is one of hope in Marcel's sense, then it makes sense that there would be a kind of quiet. Well, sorry, I mean, one we might hope, in other words, that things at their most real are finally aesthetically beautiful. We might have this hope that we live in this finally, that we live in this world where reality at its deepest is just final aesthetic value. And if that's true, then you can explain why we couldn't say much about it because we're in the trial. You can't analyze it. So I'm not trying to say that our situation warrants hope. But what I am trying to say is this: the veracity of beauty is a sort of necessary part of our experience of beauty. This is like, you could call this a sort of quasi-transcendentalist answer. We can't help but hope that things at their realist are finally beautiful. We can't help but hope that at the bottom level, things are beautiful. Now, obviously, every time I say this, my mind goes right to Voltaire and Leibniz. And you might worry that there's a kind of Panglossian naive optimism. I'm not trying to say that there's a reason to be optimistic. I just suspect that in these kinds of art critics, um, to make sense of the kinds of things that they're saying, I think you only can make sense of with a view like this. Now, should I quickly address three objections or should I stop for a break and questions?
I guess if you can quickly outline them, then that might also inform us when it comes to asking questions. So, yeah, go ahead.
You got it. Yes, absolutely. Great idea. So just really quickly, I think there are just three objections I have. One is like you need to define reality. You can't say that beauty has to do with the deepest sense of reality if you're not going to define reality. Or to put it this way, to defend the claim that beauty could consist in reality ever, you owe a substantive account of reality. And I say, no, I do not owe you this. I don't have to tell you what reality is. First of all, that's the metaphysician's job. It's not the aesthetician's job. Although I don't want to break, that's not really what I want to say. That's just a tactical move. So, for one thing, this is just my first step in understanding the view. But I mean, look, you can see all these views say very different things about what reality could consist in, psychologically, personally, particularly. I want to understand this as a kind of meta-aesthetic view. And I mean, look, does the hedonist owe? No one asks the hedonist, you have to tell me what pleasure is. I've never heard this. Uh, I mean, maybe that's a reason to, maybe that's the very objection for hedonism. But I think if the hedonist doesn't owe us a substantive account of pleasure, I don't think we need a substantive account of reality. And look, I also like, I never thought to be a hedonist, you need to tell me what you need. You owe me a substantive account of pleasure. So I don't think I owe you a substantive account of reality. I also think well, yeah, okay, I'll stop. Let's go to objection two. You might say that this is medieval bullshit. You might say this is what we might call the scientistic objection. You might say there are no levels to reality. There's nothing deeper or more shallow. This is what my philosophy of science colleagues say. They say this is an incredibly outdated view of how the world is. And yes, the reductionists or scientists objection. I think this is maybe an objection I should might come up, might deal with sooner in the paper. I think I do have a minimally substantive conception of reality. So I think there probably are levels to reality, and this is why my having more interest in Platonism or Aristotelianism may be alienating my audience. However, I have good news for you if you are a reductionist or a scientistic person in this way. This is where the quasi-transcendentalist move helps here. Uh, on the Marcel line, you don't have to say anything about the way reality actually it is. We're just talking about our position in reality. And the idea is we can't help but hope that reality has this kind of structure, some more depth, some more is finally aesthetically valuable. I mean, I kind of mushed these into here, but there's another point, which is that, look, even, I mean, look, I think this kind of misunderstands reality as being purely physical reality. But I mean, there's psychological reality too. And if what I said about Caravaggio, if what Friedman and Friedberg, or sorry, if Fried and Friedberg are right about Caravaggio, that's a way of getting at some deeper sort of psychological reality. And you can keep your scientism about the physical world, but I invite you to have um, a levels to your conception of psychological life. Third, this is the last objection, I believe. No, you're wrong to say that beauty is about reality because Plato was so wrong. Beauty is not about the forms of things. Beauty is about the appearance of things. So, think about this is what Kierkegaard might say. This is what in fact, this is an objection that Schiller considers when he says, why should we even care about reality? So we could call this the formalist objection. Oh, yes, Schiller considers this objection. But Schiller's reply is that formal elements are aesthetically valuable inasmuch as they correspond to deeper formal elements in reality. So even if I mean, to the extent that you think that beauty is about appearance, there's still a structured form to appearance, and that structured form could still correspond with some sort of deeper reality. Yes, I'll stop there. Thank you so much for listening.